From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Being diagnosed with chronic depression or bipolar disorder can be scary. These conditions can come with feelings of sadness or despair or mood swings. But a researcher at the University of Colorado says we might be thinking too simplistically about these disorders. June Gruber is a professor of psychology and neuroscience who specializes in research around happiness. And she recently looked into silver linings or side benefits of some common mood disorders.
I always say we talk about them in terms of deficits, dysfunction, disruption, and difficulties. What we're not doing is acknowledging that it's not all a doom and gloom story.
June and her research team found those silver linings can include a greater ability to cope with life's stresses, a tendency toward creativity, and a richer social life. June spoke with me in December about her research, which was partly inspired by watching how her father handled living with bipolar disorder. We're listening back to that conversation today.
I think many of us have family members, close friends who have histories of mental illness, who inspire us, who we love, and who we learn from. And I think my dad was really no exception here. He has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and had some very severe periods of depression as well as mania. And on the one hand, absolutely, it was very challenging for him. He wasn't able to work for an extended period. And while that is true, he also describes the way it really transformed who he was and the way he looked at life. He talks about becoming a more grounded person, about seeing the world with a newfound appreciation, even inspiration, and that in a sense, it really connected him more to others around him. So in that sense, I think some of my own dad's experiences are also what we found in the literature when we dug a little more deeply about silver linings.
Yeah, you and your research team reviewed a lot of studies about depression and bipolar, and you looked for what you called these silver linings. I want to walk through the main areas where you observed that people with mood disorders can see benefit. One of the silver linings is their ability to empathize. What makes someone with bipolar or chronic depression more empathetic and even more cooperative with people around them?
I think that's a wonderful question because a lot of the literature, when talking about depression or bipolar disorder, what we call mood disorders, casts them in terms of difficulties with social relationships, with greater social strain. But what we were finding, and even some evidence from our own lab, found that in fact they're more likely to be tuned into others and cooperate. Some studies found kind of a greater ability to empathize or connect with others. Now, while the verdict's still out as to the why, or what we call kind of the mechanism that may drive this, we're curious and really thinking about if you've lived through times of struggle, times of strain, you may come out the other side with a greater ability to appreciate the struggles and strains other people go through as well.
It paints a different picture of just thinking of someone as withdrawn and that's it. We should note also a person might see fewer silver linings if their mood disorder is more severe. But I want to talk about the next benefit you observed. Folks with mood disorders tend to have strong social bonds. How does a mood disorder translate into a healthy social circle?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also want to just echo the point you raised, which is that not everyone may have silver linings, and certainly in the most acute or severe periods of depression, those may be hard to reap. So we definitely don't want to cast generalizations to everyone at every stage of depression. But I do appreciate the point you raise, and this is a finding by my wonderful graduate student here, Stevie, who looked at a large sample of young adults. This is over 1,000 young adults, and looked at their associations between their tendency to be at risk for severe mood difficulties like bipolar disorder and their social network with their peers. And we found that those young adults who scored higher on a measure of bipolar risk tendencies actually reported that they had a larger social network. They also reported greater perceived social support, Now, we always want to balance that with the fact that they also reported sometimes greater social strain.
Mm.
So there are silver linings, but that doesn't mean, as you said, it's an all good Pollyanna story. These are complex disorders that have many kinds of social consequences, but we also need to talk about the positive ones.
One more silver lining you found is creativity.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I found this maybe a little unsurprising. I think we've all heard the cliche of the tortured artist. What does your research suggest about a link between mood disorders like schizophrenia and creativity?
Yeah, I've long followed and really found fascinating this literature linking creativity with what we often think of as, quote, more severe forms of psychological disorders, schizophrenia, psychosis when it occurs in bipolar disorder,
Mhm.
and the like. And many people may even recall famous writers like Virginia Woolf, who frequently reflected on her own periods of severe depression with, opening her creative writing and understanding of the world. But beyond these kind of anecdotes, there's been some really interesting studies. There was one that really cut across over 30 studies that found these really interesting links between creativity and bipolar disorder, even more mild schizophrenia.
Hmm.
And the thinking is, perhaps people who have these wide ranges of mood experiences or unusual kinds of thoughts or beliefs about the world, perhaps they also open up these new windows or ways of thinking, of linking the ideas, of coming up with novel associations. All of these are part of creativity, too.
You found some skepticism or resistance to your findings, including some scientific journals that didn't want to publish your work. What was their objection, and what does this tell you about how people think about these conditions?
Yeah, I think we've made important progress in combating stigma towards mental health disorders, but I think we still have a ways to go,
Hmm.
even within our own field. For example, what you pointed out is when we first tried to publish some of our own silver linings research, we got pushback from some of our scientific peers suggesting that any differences in things like cooperation must mean that it must be a fault of individuals with depression, that perhaps they're more easily taken advantage of or maybe not advocating for their own needs.
Hmm.
Whereas we found and argued that not all differences between people with and without mental disorders should be cast as, again, a deficit, disturbance, disorder, or dysfunction on the part of the individual with that lived experience. And in fact, many abilities among individuals with mood disorders, anxiety, substance use are not only intact or preserved, but may even be enhanced, as we see with the silver linings.
Dr. June Gruber is a professor at CU Boulder, where she runs the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Lab. She spoke with me in December about her research into side benefits associated with mood conditions like chronic depression and bipolar disorder. We'll put a link to more on her work and some advice from her previous In The NoCo appearance on how to live a happier life in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.